Hey everyone, today we're diving into the story of a Kenworth W900 truck, an iconic piece of trucking history. This classic rig hails from the first generation of W900 models, making it a rare find for enthusiasts of vintage trucks. The current owner picked it up for $2,750 after it had been sitting in one spot for many years. Now the challenge is whether it can be brought back to life. This truck is powered by a Cummins 855 engine, capable of producing 400 horsepower. While the engine's power is impressive for its time, the real concern here is its condition after years of being idle. The first inspection revealed the fuel tank was still holding old fuel that's no longer usable. Inside the cab, it's a complete mess. Dirt and debris scattered everywhere, a clear sign of years of neglect. The radiator still holds antifreeze, but the exact level couldn't be determined. Considering how long it's been out of service, these issues aren't surprising. The purchase price might be a bit steep for a project like this. A fairer deal would have been closer to $1,000. However, the owner didn't buy this truck with a full restoration in mind. Instead, it's more of a personal project, a chance to tinker with a piece of history and maybe get it running again. Fully restoring this truck likely wouldn't make financial sense, but salvaging parts or making it operational could still bring some satisfaction. This particular truck belongs to the first generation of Kenworth W900 models, which were introduced during the early days of the series. Many people might confuse it with the W900A, a later version from the second generation that came out a few years after this one. The previous owner's son was the one who decided to sell it, and now it's in the hands of someone who's ready to give it a shot at revival. The first steps involved inspecting the fuel system. The owner checked the main fuel lines and reconnected a secondary tank. Since the old fuel was unusable, the main fuel line had to be disconnected and flushed. The fuel filter, although old and worn, wasn't replaced. Instead, it was cleaned and reinstalled to avoid any potential contamination. Fresh fuel will be added before attempting to turn over the engine. One interesting feature of this truck is its long nose design, which shares the same chassis as the cab-over models that were common back in the day. During the early years, cab-overs had a practical advantage. They could carry more cargo and were easier to maneuver in tight spaces. But as regulations changed, allowing longer vehicles, long-nosed trucks became popular for their comfort. The extended cabin space provided a better resting area for drivers on long hauls. Even so, cab-overs remain the preferred choice for situations requiring maximum flexibility and compactness. With the fuel system prepped, the owner powered up the truck. Surprisingly, the heater fan was still functional, but it seemed stuck, possibly from years of inactivity or water damage in the engine. This raised concerns about whether the engine cylinders might be seized. To address this, the owner plans to open the cylinder heads and investigate further. The truck also comes equipped with a 13-speed manual transmission, adding to its vintage charm and mechanical complexity. This truck is more than just a machine. It's a piece of history and a reminder of how trucking has evolved over the decades. For now, the goal is to get it running, even if only partially restored. While the road ahead might be long and challenging, the process of breathing new life into this old workhorse is a labor of love that every vintage truck enthusiast can appreciate. Hey folks, today we're diving into the story of a Kenworth W900, a true icon of trucking history. This beauty is from the first generation of the W900 series, a piece of machinery that marked the early days of what would become one of the most recognizable names in trucking. The current owner snagged it for $2,750 after it had been sitting unused and neglected for years. Now the challenge is to see if it can be revived and brought back to life. This truck is powered by a Cummins 855 engine, delivering 400 horsepower, a powerhouse for its time. But after sitting idle for so long, the condition of the engine is the big question mark. An initial inspection revealed that the fuel tank still contained some old fuel, though it was far beyond being usable. Inside the cab, it was chaos. Dirt, debris, and years of dust had accumulated, leaving the interior in a rough state. The radiator, surprisingly, still held antifreeze, though the exact level couldn't be determined. For a truck that's been out of service for this long, none of this comes as a shock. The purchase price might feel a bit high for a truck in such a state, especially considering its condition. A price closer to $1,000 would have been more reasonable. However, this wasn't a purchase made with financial return in mind. For the owner, it's a passion project, a chance to work on something with history and see if it can be brought back to working condition. Fully restoring it might not be worth the cost, but getting it operational or salvaging some of its parts could still make the effort worthwhile. This particular W900 is from the original lineup, which makes it even more special for truck enthusiasts. Some might confuse it with the W900A, but that model came later as part of the second generation. This truck is firmly rooted in the early days of Kenworth's legacy, making it a rare and valuable piece of history. It was sold by the previous owner's son, passing it on to someone who's ready to take on the challenge of reviving this classic machine. The first step in the restoration process involved inspecting the fuel system. The main fuel lines were checked and a secondary tank was reattached. Since the old fuel was no longer usable, the fuel lines had to be flushed out. The fuel filter, though old and worn, wasn't replaced. Instead, it was carefully cleaned and reinstalled to avoid contamination. Fresh fuel was then added to prepare for the next step, seeing if the engine would turn over. One of the unique features of this truck is its long-nose design, which shares its chassis with the cab-over models popular during its time. Back in the day, cab-overs were more practical. They could carry more cargo and were easier to maneuver in tight spaces. But as regulations evolved, allowing for longer vehicles, long-nose trucks gained popularity for their comfort and extended cabin space. These trucks provided drivers with better rest areas for long hauls, making them a preferred choice for cross-country trips. Despite their bulkier design, cab-overs still had an edge when it came to navigating narrow or crowded areas. After prepping the fuel system, the owner powered up the truck for the first time in years. To their surprise, the heater fan still worked, though it seemed stuck, possibly due to rust or water damage in the engine. This raised concerns that the cylinders might be seized. The next step is to open the cylinder heads to investigate further and address any potential damage. The truck also features a 13-speed manual transmission, a mechanical marvel that adds to the charm and complexity of this classic rig. This truck isn't just another piece of machinery, it's a time capsule, a living reminder of how the trucking industry has evolved. Reviving it is about more than just making it run. It's about preserving a piece of history and celebrating the craftsmanship of an earlier era. While the road to restoration may be long and full of challenges, the process of bringing this old workhorse back to life is a journey that any vintage truck enthusiast would find deeply rewarding. Whether it ends up fully restored or simply operational again, the story of this Kenworth W900 is far from over. The truck's battery was running low, so the team found themselves jump-starting it repeatedly. They used a pickup truck nearby to connect some old batteries, but all the attempts to start the engine had nearly drained what little power was left. The best course of action would have been to keep the pickup truck running to ensure the battery stayed fully charged. With that setup, they could maintain a steady supply of voltage while troubleshooting. To proceed, they reconnected the wiring and removed the intake pipe to get a better look. At this point, the turbocharger became visible. And yes, turbochargers were indeed a thing back when this truck was built. Technology like this has been around for quite some time. While inspecting the system, they decided to connect a temporary fuel tank, a common method for testing older vehicles. This kind of workaround is something you'll see often in videos involving classic truck startups. For some regions where industrialization came later, it might seem like a modern approach, but this technique has long been part of working with older machinery. They also noticed the turbocharger wasn't securely fastened. Since a loose turbo can lead to significant problems, they tightened the clamps and made sure everything was properly secured. Trucks like this are prone to a potentially dangerous phenomenon called engine runaway. This happens when the engine starts burning fuel or oil uncontrollably, causing it to rev at full throttle with no way to shut it off. When this occurs, traditional methods of turning off the engine often fail. The only effective solution is to block the engine's air intake, starving it of oxygen. Anticipating this, they prepared a piece of cardboard and some wooden boards, ready to cut off the air supply immediately if needed. It's important to avoid using materials like cloth, as they can be sucked into the engine, damaging the internal components. These precautions might seem excessive, but they're critical when working with vintage machines like this. With the preparations complete, they decided it was time for the big moment, starting the truck. After a few tense moments, the engine roared to life. Hearing the sound of the truck starting up after years of sitting idle was a thrilling experience for the owner and everyone involved. It's not every day you get to see a piece of history come alive again. Naturally, seeing the truck running might make you wonder, could it be restored to its original factory condition? While the idea sounds appealing, the reality is much more complicated. The cost of a full restoration would be astronomical, far exceeding the truck's current value. This isn't a rare, limited edition model, and it doesn't have any special historical significance. For a project like this to make sense, there would need to be a deeper story behind it, something personal or emotional that gives it added value. Perhaps if this truck had belonged to a father or grandfather, restoring it could serve as a way to preserve a family legacy. It's these kinds of stories that make the effort and expense worthwhile. Without that emotional connection, however, the high cost of restoration simply doesn't add up. Fully restoring this truck would likely cost more than buying a new one, making it impractical for most people. Even with the engine running, the truck has numerous issues. The turbocharger produces unusual noises, and there's no guarantee the engine is in good enough shape for regular use. For most people, this truck might be worth only a few $100s, more like a scrap removal fee than a serious investment. Still, for a true enthusiast, the satisfaction lies in the process itself. Bringing an old machine back to life, even partially, is a labor of love that speaks to a passion for history and mechanics. While this truck may never be restored to perfection, getting it running again is a victory in its own right. And that wraps up today's video. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.